Hello and welcome to another episode of the Toronto Dogcast, the podcast for dog lovers. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about dog aggression and some of the different options that people out there can choose when trying to address this problem. The reason why I chose to talk about aggression issues is because it's the most common symptom that triggers people to actually go out and seek help. Now, we're going to be talking about a lot of different options today, and we're going to spend the majority of today's podcast talking about Doggie Boot Camp because that's the most popular option. That's the one option that I get questions about most often. So before we get started, I just want to say a big thank you to all the people out there who support the podcast and who drop those likes and subscribe to the channel. I really do appreciate it. You guys are the best dog lovers out there, and your support means a lot to me. So keep it up. So when we talk about dog aggression, it comes in many different shapes and forms. The most important thing I want to emphasize to people is that aggression in it of itself is not a problem. It is a symptom of a problem. And just like when you get a sneeze or a cough, it could mean that you have allergies. It could mean that you have the flu or the common cold. You have the exact same symptoms, even though the problem that's causing those symptoms can be very different from each other. So dog aggression symptoms are one of those really controversial subjects that people don't really understand and that there's a lot of different opinions on. So I'm going to give you my opinion, and this is just my opinion. If you have a different opinion, go ahead and put those in the comments. I'll make sure and read them later on. But this is going to be my take on it. I have a lot of experience. We're talking over 20 years of experience dealing with behavioral problems in dogs, specifically the more difficult cases. Before we talk about some of the different options that can address aggression in your dogs, let's talk about the aggression symptoms themselves, because there's a lot of different levels of aggression out there. The symptoms can be as mild as some growling, maybe some barking. And as it escalates, it gets more and more intense and therefore more and more dangerous for both your dog and other dogs and maybe even yourself. Judging whether your dog's aggression symptoms are minor or major is sometimes really difficult, and that's why people call me. So when I talk to people on the phone and they're describing the types of symptoms that they're observing, I ask them a lot of probing questions just to get an idea of how severe it is and how serious it is, but I can't really assess the level of severity of a dog's aggression issues until I actually see those symptoms for myself. So judging those things, here's a couple quick ways that you can tell. So one is intensity, like how intense is the aggression? How quickly does it escalate? I think the most important differentiator is, does your dog make a lot of noise? That old saying of a dog's bark is worse than its bite. That lends itself to understanding like just how severe it is. A lot of dogs, especially dogs with anxiety issues, will exhibit aggression symptoms simply just to get some space. They have no intention of hurting another dog. They just want to create space. And that's very common. I would say the more severe or serious aggression issues come from dogs that actually bite. And not just nipping. Nipping is usually quite minor, but dogs actually bite. And if a dog expresses aggression towards another dog and that dog moves away and your dog then disengages from their aggression, then it's probably not as serious. But again, it's very hard to differentiate between the two. The other sign of something more serious when it comes to aggression is whether a dog directs aggression towards people. It's a lot more common and a lot more normal, in fact, for dogs to express aggression towards each other than it is if a dog's expressing aggression towards a person. It's much more serious, especially if that person is part of the family or part of the direct interactions that dog has on a day-to-day basis. So that's an important factor. Now, all these things are just anecdotal. The reality is, if you really want to know whether your dog has more severe or serious aggression issues, it's probably good to look inwards. If your dog is aggressive and that makes you afraid of your dog, well, that's a pretty good sign that it's serious, because you should never be afraid of your dog in any case, any shape or form. So what to do? Well, the best thing to do when it comes to the different options that you have available is to do some research to try and see if there's anything out there that you can try. Now, for example, if your dog is playing with another dog and it gets a little rough and it transitions from being a little rough to actually a little bit of fighting, that's probably not too serious unless it continues to escalate. But if your dog is consistently showing aggression towards people, let's say, or resource guarding with toys or with food, and you, as the person who's in that dog's family, goes to feed or take that toy away or something, and that dog expresses aggression towards you, that's much more serious. Okay? Now, when I talk about aggression, I don't want to confuse people, because, again, aggression itself is not the problem. There's an underlying issue that causes aggression to be a problem. Usually what dogs will do is they will go through a number of different techniques, especially if they're anxious, to cope, to communicate that they're uncomfortable, that another dog or another person is in their space and they want a little bit of space. And a lot of people will dismiss or ignore those more subtle hints that your dog is trying to tell you that, hey, I'm uncomfortable here, very unsure. I don't really want you to pet me right now. Happens a lot with smaller dogs because people just can't help themselves. They want to pick up the dog. They want to pet the dog, whether the dog is open to receiving affection or not. So what dogs will do is they will go through a number of more subtle steps to communicate to other dogs or to other people that, hey, I'm not okay with this. And when those techniques are ignored, they have to keep going to find a coping mechanism that's going to work. And usually what happens is they will land on aggression. And what they'll find is that when they're aggressive, people back off. Other dogs back off. And once they find that that technique works for them, they'll continue to use it. They'll stick with it. So that's how aggression can develop from a minor issue into a major issue, because people just ignore the symptoms or the signs that their dogs are giving them that, hey, I'm uncomfortable. And that's just one example for anxiety. Like I said, we could talk about aggression and how aggression becomes a more serious issue. That could be a whole podcast onto of it. So this podcast is about some of the different options, because at the end of the day, what I tell people is that it doesn't actually matter why your dog has whatever issue or whatever problem or whatever symptom. The most important thing that I tell people to focus on is doing something about it, and doing something about it as early as possible. Because the earlier you start to address your dog's issues, the easier it's going to be for them to dissipate. You can nip it in the bud and a minor problem will go away relatively quickly. The longer people leave it, the worse it gets. The worse it gets, the worse it gets, pretty much. It's like a vicious cycle. So people will find coping mechanisms themselves and they'll say, oh, well, my dog doesn't like big dogs, or my dog just doesn't like dogs that are on leash or off leash or whatever the case may be. And they'll try to isolate that problem and just say, you know what, I'm just going to avoid big fluffy dogs, or I'm going to avoid other dogs that are on leash or off leash. And what happens is it intensifies the problem. It makes it worse. And the worse it gets, the harder it is to deal with. And that's usually when people eventually call me. Unfortunately, that's the majority of the cases that I work with are pretty far gone in that they've had the issues or the problems with aggression for quite some time. And people have done various things to mitigate it or try to avoid it. And all it's done is make it worse and make the people more anxious or whatever the case may be. And then it's much more difficult to deal with. And that's when I get involved. So let's talk about some of the options that you have for dealing with aggression symptoms. The first one is just to reach out to me. People can find me very easily on Instagram or YouTube, and you can send me a direct message. Be more than happy to talk to people and offer them some advice. Try to see if there's some exercises that I can recommend, maybe even send them some videos. That's option number one, and it's completely free, and I'm glad to do it. The whole purpose of this podcast and my YouTube channel and everything else is to help dogs and help the people that love them. That's as simple as it gets. So I try to do what I can for as many people as possible. I even had somebody from Australia call me up and say, hey, look, I'm not anywhere near Toronto, so coming to you for one-on-one help isn't going to be an option. But I spoke with them for over 2.5 hours, trying to make some recommendations that helped, some exercises to address the issue, and it did work. So that's option number one. And that's usually pretty effective if people catch it early. And that's the key. Option number two is a one-on-one private session with me. And in that session, I will spend the afternoon, and it's not fixed to a specific amount of time. I just spend the afternoon and I'll take the people and that dog through a number of different exercises. I'll also observe and diagnose what I think is the issue and try some different things out. That particular option works best for, again, minor or kind of medium level intensity of a problem. For a lot of dogs, that works, especially if the people are really keen and really open-minded and are willing to learn and do the work, do the practice. So after the session, I'll make a bunch of recommendations. I'll give them a schedule of here's what you need to do. Here's how often you need to do it. Here's probably about how long it takes. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how long it takes. You just need to address the problem. The last option, and by far the most popular, is Doggie Boot Camp. And Doggie Boot Camp is one of those things that the name doesn't really explain what it is. So Doggie Boot Camp is for dogs that have much more serious issues. Doggie Boot Camp, essentially, in a nutshell, is when a dog comes to live with me for about a week. The reason why it's so popular is because the average person is just not properly equipped or doesn't have the proper experience or skill sets to really handle a dog with aggression symptoms. There's a lot of risk. There's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to doing these types of techniques. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not for the average person. There's risk involved, and there's risk to your dog. There's risk to other dogs, and also risk to you. It's very common for dogs with aggression issues, if they get really frustrated and they can't get at what they're being aggressive towards, to redirect out of sheer frustration, and they'll actually bite the person that's trying to hold them back because they can reach them. So there's a lot of risk involved, and it's not something that I recommend the average person do on their own. Now, with supervision and some coaching, yeah, it's fine. You can definitely do it. And when I spend a one-on-one session with somebody who's got an aggressive dog, I'll do the first part for them first. I don't let people just dive right in. So I'll do some of the work with the dogs. Once I get them to the point where it's manageable, then I'll get the owners involved. And the reason why it's so risky is because people get really nervous. They get really anxious, especially if their dog has a pattern of aggressive behavior. Now, Doggy Boot Camp allows me to do a lot of things, but I'd say the most powerful of all of the tools that I have available is just eliminating as many variables as possible to really understand what is causing this aggression. Where are these symptoms coming from? What is triggering their underlying issues? And that's the real key, is to address the problem, not the symptom. And that way you have a long-term solution. Avoiding a problem is only going to make it worse. Although in the short term, you might, be able to avoid the symptoms coming up, but it won't address the underlying issue. So when I talk about eliminating as many variables as possible, there's a lot of things that can trigger or cause a dog to become aggressive. And most of those come down to the people. It's not a blame thing. It's an accountability thing. So if you're walking down the street, for example, and you're very nervous, you're very anxious about what your dog is going to be doing or how it's going to behave, you see another dog walking towards you, it's very common for people to tense up and to get nervous and anxious because they're worried. And it's a normal human reaction. However, it's going to make the problem worse. And it's actually, believe it or not, in a lot of cases going to trigger the behavior because you're sending a signal to your dog through the leash saying, okay, I'm nervous. So the dog is sitting there going, okay, well, why are you nervous? Okay, there's another dog coming towards us. That must be why you're nervous. Okay, maybe I should be on guard too. And the whole thing perpetuates itself. So boot camp allows me to have as much consistency as possible with the only big variable being the dog that I'm working with. The other thing that is of huge benefit when it comes to Doggy Boot Camp is I have my dogs, Mosley and Mackenzie. I have access to them. So when a dog comes to boot camp, they actually become part of the family. They do everything that my dogs do. They got the same routine, the same walking schedule, all that kind of stuff. And oftentimes the first relationship that a dog aggressive dog will have is with my dogs, Mosley and Mackenzie. So they're totally used to it and they're totally chill and content. They've seen it all. And sometimes I feel bad because they're like, oh, great, another crazy dog. But they love it. They don't get nervous. They don't get anxious. They know that I got their back and that I'm going to take care of them. And the situation is completely safe for them. When I introduce a dog into my family and into my environment, before I do that, the first thing I do is build some trust and a relationship. And the way I do that is through the walk. And dogs build relationships. They build trust through the walk because they can feel your energy. They can sense that, okay, this guy's going to take care of me. I don't know him, but I'm going to get to know him. And then when I introduce them to Mosley and Mackenzie, it's also on a walk. And the walk creates an environment where their mind can move forward. And that's really key. That I use Mosley and Mackenzie as those, they're really healing in terms of a dog's recovery. And they build bonds and relationships with each other, with Mosley and Mackenzie first. And then I layer the difficulty or the challenge with that dog as that dog gets comfortable. So it's a very slow process. It's a very methodical, gradual process. It's not very exciting to watch. That's why I stopped doing the videos. I used to do videos on YouTube all the time, like, oh, this dog has this problem. This is what I'm going to do with it. And nobody watched them because it was boring to watch. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like something that you would see on TV where, a dog's going crazy and then the next thing you know, it's all calm and delicious. It's much more methodical. It's much more gradual. My approach is very gentle. And, I won't put a dog into a situation that I don't think that they're ready for. Now, I will challenge them, but I need to build up their confidence level. And I do it very slowly and very gradually so that the dog understands that there's no need to be anxious. There's no need to be nervous. There's no need to be fearful. And those are the most common causes for dogs to become aggressive. There's a lot of other reasons, but those are the most common and the most serious, and those are the most difficult to deal with. It takes the longest amount of time, and it also takes the most amount of patience and persistence. And this is why the average person usually isn't well equipped, because I've been doing this for over 20 years. It's something that I'm extremely comfortable with. And the mental image that I have in my head is a fresh one. I didn't live with that dog. I don't have any negative thoughts in my head. And if they make a mistake and become aggressive, and if those symptoms do appear, I stay even keeled and we just practice it. We do it over and over and over. And I start with very low levels of intensity. So when I'm walking with a dog that is aggressive, what you'll see, and you can check this out on my Instagram, is that I'll have Mosley, who is my old man. He's been doing this for a very long time. He's 13 years old. He'll be the furthest away from me. And they're all walking in a line parallel to me. So they're not ahead of me. They're not behind me. They're right beside me. So I'll have Mosley furthest away. I'll have Mackenzie, who's my younger dog, next to him. And then I'll have the dog that I'm working with right next to me, with Mosley and Mackenzie on one side and me on the other side. So that dog has a buffer on both sides of pure calmness. And what happens is when we're walking down the street or the sidewalk and they see a dog that they would normally react to, they'll take their cues from Mosley and Mackenzie and from me to say, okay, well, they're not nervous. They're not anxious. They're not fearful. And if for any reason that other dog comes near us, well, there's buffer on either side. So to the left, they have Mosley and Mackenzie, and to the right, they have me. And that's how that dog builds trust, because they understand that I'm going to take care of them and that they're part of the family. They're part of, I don't like to use the word pack, but basically a pack is a family. It's a group of dogs, basically. And I'm not saying that I'm a dog, but that's how the dogs are perceiving things. So when I'm talking to people over the phone, I'm trying to explain the different techniques that I use and that kind of thing. I explain everything from a dog's perspective, not from a human's perspective. So I don't interpret their behavior from a human standpoint. I interpret it from a dog standpoint. So the first couple of days of boot camp it's pretty boring. It's not really exciting stuff. Again, it's all about establishing a level of comfort, a level of trust and leadership with that dog so that you can then move forward to start to address the more specific issues, the more specific triggers that that dog has. And it allows me time to really diagnose that dog's issues, because I'm going to be putting them in a lot of different situations, both at home and especially out in public. Now, the other thing that I have at my disposal is I'm very familiar with this neighborhood that I live in. And there's hundreds of dogs that live downtown Toronto on the waterfront. It's a beautiful area of the city. If you haven't been, definitely recommend coming to visit. There's a really cool dog park, huge. It's right on the water. That's about 10-minute walk from me. There's lots of dogs that live in my building. So any type of environment or situation, I can recreate it. And that's the real power of boot camp, is recreating the types of scenarios where that dog exhibits aggressive behavior and taking a very gradual approach to helping that dog experience those situations without becoming anxious or nervous. And if they do display aggressive symptoms, like I said, we just keep on repeating it. And that's why it's a very slow process. It doesn't happen overnight. It's very gradual, right? So you'll have a dog with whatever aggression symptoms and whatever issues. And once I diagnose it, it's just a matter of decreasing. So first it decreases in intensity, then it decreases in frequency, and then eventually it'll dissipate, because that dog is understanding that there are different ways to deal with their anxiety, and that there's no reason for them to become anxious or nervous. Now, boot camp isn't magic. It's hard work. And that's why it's about a week. Because it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of patience, it takes a lot of repetition, it takes a lot of persistence. A lot of the dogs that I work with, they've been exhibiting these types of issues for years. So undoing them in a week, there's only so much I can do. And the purpose of the boot camp isn't to magically wave my fingers and say, boom, there you go, your dog's completely cured. The purpose of the boot camp is to do the heavy lifting, to do the really difficult initial work with a dog to get the majority of the intense issues resolved, so that at the end of boot camp, the family can take over and I can make a very specific list of recommendations as to what they need to do, how they need to do it, how often they need to do it in order to continue the recovery process. And it usually takes weeks. So even though a dog spends a week in boot camp, the work is just really getting going. They're probably, when they leave boot camp, the average dog is around 85% recovered, meaning that they're able to overcome the normal circumstances in which they become aggressive or anxious or nervous. And again, identifying the symptoms, yeah, that's pretty easy. But then really understanding how to address the underlying problem, that's much more difficult. And that's where boot camp is super handy, because a lot of dogs, when they have these types of issues, it's inconsistent, meaning sometimes they'll react to a dog, sometimes they won't. And people don't know how or why it happens. So boot camp really allows me a lot of time and a lot of different situations where I'm not only reading that dog, but I'm also reading my dogs, because how they respond to a dog that's in boot camp is very telling. It's a tool for me to use as an indication of what's actually going on with that dog. And it really helps that they have role models to understand that, hey, these dogs are totally chill. They're totally calm. And I'm nervous and I'm anxious. But, oh, this human is also really chill and really calm. So you got two dogs on one side of you. You got this meat bag on the other side of you. And everybody else is chill and calm. But I'm not. So it's much more likely that they will calm down, especially with repetition. And then as they have success and they're like, hey, you know what? I wasn't nervous and I wasn't anxious and nothing bad happened to me. This is great. And they start to really enjoy themselves, because the thing that people really sometimes miss is that when dogs are experiencing these types of issues, it is incredibly unpleasant for them. They don't enjoy it. They're just stuck and they don't know how to address it. They don't have the same coping mechanisms that you and I have. They can't go have a beer or a glass of wine to relax. They can't call up one of their friends and say, hey, you know what? I am having a really shit day. I'm really nervous about X, Y, and Z. They can't do that. Now, they try to communicate with their family in subtle ways, in different ways, to say, hey, look, I'm uncomfortable with this situation or that situation. But people just don't know what to do, or they ignore the signs that their dog's trying to tell them. So boot camp is really effective in helping dogs to hit that reset button. And the whole purpose of boot camp is just to bring a dog back to its most natural state, which is calm and chill and relaxed, stress-free, and able to do the types of things that every dog should be able to do, including interacting with other dogs, meeting new dogs, maybe even playing with new dogs. They get everything that I believe a dog needs to be well-balanced, happy, satisfied, and it's not that impressive. I mean, look, sometimes when people see the one finger walk, and again, if you haven't seen it on Instagram, go check it out. I can walk pretty much any dog. Shouldn't say pretty much. I can walk any dog with one finger. And that's how relaxed that dog becomes. And I don't do it to show off. I just do it to demonstrate to people that I'm not putting any effort into the relationship that I have with this dog. It's that natural. And it's very gentle. I don't use physical force. I don't use prong collars or any type of electroshocking collars or any of that garbage. That's why it takes so long, because I have a very gentle, gradual approach that slowly builds the confidence of a dog and gives them everything that they need to let go. And dogs love to let go of the past. They don't hold on to their anxiety like we do. They are just waiting for somebody to come along and say, look, here's a different approach. Okay. And I feel you. I read you. So if a dog is telling me, hey, look, I'm uncomfortable right now, I won't force the situation. I'll give them the time that they need until they're ready to take that next step. I will continue to challenge them, but in a way that's comfortable for them. And that's really key. So I hope that gives you a little bit better idea. The other thing I want to talk about when it comes to boot camp is the onus of responsibility of the people. So what do the people do when I'm doing all this work with their dogs? Well, every single person, depending on what their dog's underlying issue is, every single person, I give them homework to do while their dog's in boot camp. So it's not like just a vacation for the people to say, oh, okay, well, dog's at the shop right now getting fixed up. And when it comes back, it's going to be perfect. It doesn't work like that at all. So people have a responsibility when their dog's in boot camp to practice becoming self-aware, to practice different ways of voicing how they're feeling, of calming themselves down when they're anxious and nervous. So all these things people do while their dog's in boot camp. So when their dog comes back to them, they're able to continue the work and to continue the momentum of their dogs recovering from whatever issue that they have. Now, I hope that explanation explains things a little bit more. Now we're going to get into some questions from the Instagram. So what I do before any podcast is I'll post on my Instagram what the subject matter or the topic is going to be, and I'll gather questions from Instagram and from Facebook and whatever, and I'll try to answer them as best I can in the podcast. Okay. So let's get to it. What is the cost? Okay. So option number one, where I just talk to people on the phone, try to give them some advice, maybe send them some links, make some recommendations on exercises they could do. Option number one, completely free. Glad to do it, glad to help. And a lot of people find it very useful and very effective. Option number two, which is a personal one-on-one session for, again, dogs that have minor or medium level type issues and really keen owners and people that learn really quickly. Option number two is very effective. Now that's $300 for the afternoon, but usually very rarely people need more than one session. Usually one is good. Actually, in fact, I can't even remember the last time somebody had more than one, but one is usually good. And those are for people who catch problems early. Option number three, which is the boot camp, is $700. That's Canadian, and prices are February 2020. And I used to do it, believe it or not, I used to do it boot camp for free. And what would happen is people didn't take it seriously. People wouldn't do any of the homework that I assigned. They wouldn't follow my recommendations after they picked up the dog. And next thing you know, the dog would be back and they're like, hey, I don't know what's going on. And one of the most important things I always tell people is like, look, if you want your dog to be different, to behave in a different way, then you need to do something different as well. So what is the definition of insanity? Well, it's doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So everybody has responsibility. Boot camp is not like taking your car to a mechanic with a problem and saying, okay, fix my car. And then you pick it up and everything's hunky-dory. The first couple weeks after boot camp are absolutely critical. They're absolutely key in terms of which way a dog goes. Do they regress and go back to their old habits? Or do they move forward? And do they progress with their recovery? And usually people are really good with it, but that's that. So another question that I got is, what should I look for in a boot camp? That's a very good question because I don't know. I don't know of other boot camps, at least in Toronto. You guys tell me in the comments whether there's another type of service like this. I know the Toronto Humane Society has behavioral experts as well that do this type of work. I don't know whether they take dogs for a certain period of time that are really serious and integrate them into a calm pack of dogs that are known quantities, but maybe they do. But what I would say is, if there's other boot camps out there, is do your due diligence. Talk to other people who have participated in the boot camp. That's obviously a good way of understanding what people go through and what people experience. I had one of the people that had their dog in boot camp on my podcast about dog anxiety. So you definitely want to check that out. And the reason why I wanted that person, her name's Amy, lovely person. Big shout out to Peanut as well. One of the biggest reasons why I wanted her on the podcast is to explain what the experience is like from a personal point of view, not from the dog's point of view. What to look for, definitely experience, talk to other people who have been through it. The technique, the approach, I would say is really important. My technique is not the only technique that's effective. In fact, I get a lot of heat from other trainers on the internets that my technique isn't the right one. Right? So I've heard it all. And there's a lot more than one technique. And I don't preach. In fact, a lot of times when I'm working with a dog, I'll have to use multiple techniques because every dog is different and every dog has a unique set of problems and underlying issues. So it's not always the same techniques. There's certain fundamentals that I always practice, but the techniques in terms of how I address a dog's anxiety levels or fear issues, there's a lot of different opinions out there. So what I would say is ask about the techniques, the approaches that people use, and see if it's something that jives with you. Somebody who does this type of work is generally not a dog trainer, although there are exceptions, I'm sure, in the States. I don't know of any in Canada. So usually people fall into one of two camps. They fall into dog training or this type of work. Dog training is very lucrative. It's very high volume. You can make a lot of money. People do it for a living. I don't do this for a living. I do it because I'm passionate about it. And I do it because I'm really good at it. And I get the results. Definitely ask a lot of questions. Be skeptical. I always encourage people to be skeptical. Don't take my word for it. Make up your own mind. Do your research. But regardless of what solution that people do, it's more important that they do something about it. The worst thing you can do with a dog with aggression issues is nothing. Even worse is to avoid the issues with that dog. So if your dog is aggressive towards other dogs, don't just ignore it. Don't avoid other dogs. That's just going to make it worse. And if there's one piece of advice that I would give people, just address it one way or another. So that question was from BB Joshua 001 from Instagram. Josh, thanks so much for your question. Proof of vaccinations. As long as vaccinations, I think these days they're good for a couple years. As long as there's no medical issues that are contagious or that are serious that I need to know about, it's fine. So whatever diet that a dog is on, that's pretty much the only thing that I'll keep up. Everything else I have available here. So basically, I have extra beds, I have a crate, extra leashes, toys, bones, you name it. So people bring me a list of the symptoms and I'll work through them all. And what I tell people is, hey, look, tell me your dream scenario and I'll make it happen. And you would be surprised. People out there that have dogs with behavioral issues, some of their dreams go a little something like this. I would love to walk my dog down the street in public. That's it. Like, that's somebody's dream. So everybody out there who has a dog with some sort of behavioral issue, you're not alone. There's lots of people out there who have the most simplest of dreams. And I make those dreams come true, and it makes me feel really good. And it's really fulfilling work, and I love doing it. So I encourage everybody out there, whether you choose to bring your dog to Doggy Boot Camp or you just want to follow some of the dogs that I work with on Instagram, check it out. I'll put my Instagram here. And if you have questions, don't be afraid to put something in the comments below. Send me a direct message on Instagram. I'd be more than happy to talk to any of you lovely folks, no matter where in the world you are, and see what I can do to help. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. And if you love your dog, take them for a walk. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.